All right, well, good morning, Elmont. So good to see all of you here today. We had a busy day up here yesterday. Some of you were here for it. We had Stepping Out, and so we had 50 or so Baylor students in here starting out, and then they divided up. They did projects here and at 4 homes in the area. And so if you haven't had a chance to look at it yet, which I'm sure a lot of you have not, go check out the children's area where the new carpet squares are laid down, and then the youth and children's ministry office got repainted, and then we also did some touch-up painting in the youth room. And so thank you so much for all those who showed up to help. Bob, Warren, Miles, my wife and daughter Beth and Elena, and then Marvin, I think our MVP, taught some guys some new life skills on how to lay out carpet glue and put down squares. And so he was in there training and teaching them, and they got to where they could do it on their own. And so that was a lot of work, and they were here later than they were supposed to, finishing that up. And there's still a little bit of touch-up that needs to be done in there, but the bulk of it is done, and it looks so much better. And we have lots of carpet squares left over, so we can do it again in another room on another day. So, but we'll let that rest for a while before we get there. So thank you all for being a part of that, and that was a really great day yesterday. Tonight we have our business meeting at 5 o'clock. Bring something to eat, to share, and then we'll have our meeting and hear reports from the church and see how things are going and make some decisions about the future. So be here for that. And then our next community group meeting will be not tomorrow, but next Monday on the 24th. So you're welcome to come to that. Let me know if you'd like to. We can get you a book. And then on Saturday, May 6th, we have a yard sale. We're raising money for youth and children's camps, as well as other summer activities like VBS, and Sarah's going to be doing Terrific Tuesdays this year. They're sort of like combination art camp and fun events. And so there are a lot of ways that you can help with that. You can donate items for the yard sale, of course, and we'll be collecting those the week before. You can make items for the bake sale part of that. You can also help prep for the yard sale the Friday night before. You can work the yard sale the day of the event. We're going to need trucks and trailers to help pick up large items that people can't bring themselves that Friday night before. And then when the yard sale's over, we're going to need trucks and trailers to haul off the stuff that didn't sell. So lots of ways to get involved, and there's actually a sign-up sheet out here that I just put up on the bulletin board. So you can look over there and let us know when you can help, in what different ways and things like that, and then we'll have sign-up sheets in the next couple of weeks for those who need to get items picked up. And so we don't have those quite yet. But that's coming up Saturday, May the 6th. And then this Saturday, from 6 to 9 p.m., we have a youth game night. So 7th through 12th graders meet here at the church a little after 6, or if they need rides, they can be picked up a little bit before 6, and just let Miles know about that. They're going to drive over to Baylor to spend some time in the game room where there's bowling and pool and foosball and lots of other games, and they're going to come back here and do some fun stuff here at the church. So that's 7th through 12th graders, so come, invite friends, and that'll be a fun time for you guys. And then there are leftover inserts from last week that list all our summer activities. Leftovers are out there and in the front there, so if you have kids of any age really, that tells you when Vacation Bible School and Kids Camp and Summer Camp and Terrific Tuesdays and all those things are. So please take one of those and help us spread the word about all those things. So those are our announcements. Let's greet one another for a few minutes with our welcome waves, hugs, and howdies. Well, in 1929, the Great Depression hit, and it hit very hard. The prosperity of the 1920s evaporated almost overnight. Many of today's social safety nets did not exist back then, and so people were starving. There was 25% unemployment. And something that became a staple of the efforts to help during the Great Depression, and indeed even in many charitable efforts since then, were soup kitchens. One of the first of these opened in Chicago in 1929, not too long after the Depression began, after the stock market crash. And it advertised free soup, coffee, and donuts for the unemployed. It was soon feeding over 2,200 people 3 meals a day, hot meals, no questions asked, no requests for seconds were refused. People stood in lines that wrapped around blocks waiting for these hot meals. Well, how did this happen? Who was paying for this with all the need and all the poverty, and so many had lost money? Who was paying for this? Was it the city of Chicago and the public servants elected to and appointed to serve the people? No. Was it a church or a network of churches who were using this as an opportunity to show people the love of Christ? No. It was a man by the name of Al Capone, the infamous bootlegger, crime boss, and murderer who would eventually be sent to prison for, of all things, cheating on his taxes because they could never get him on anything else in court. He was funding this. It was his soup kitchen. And many people came to actually respect and defend him because of their appreciation for what he was doing through that. It was the age of Prohibition, and one of his criminal activities was smuggling alcohol. And so through these things, he became for some kind of a Robin Hood figure. He was someone that when the government took their alcohol, he gave it back. When the government couldn't feed them, he fed them. And so a local newspaper commented that it would be rather terrifying to see Capone run for mayor of Chicago. We were afraid he would get a tremendous vote. It is even conceivable that he might get elected after a few more stunts like his soup kitchen. We're usually pretty good about knowing to stay away from people who are obviously doing things to hurt others. But we are easily fooled by people who hide their real motives behind a cloak of generosity and altruism, and who use that to increase their reputation. And what's more even than that, we can sometimes even fool ourselves into thinking that we are living and serving as Christ desired, even when our own motives have more to do with others thinking well of us. We're going back today to our series on the Sermon on the Mount. Before Easter, we finished up chapter 5, where Jesus had gone through the Beatitudes, and he had showed what kind of person we are to be as members of his kingdom, as followers of Christ, people who are humble and kind and hungering and thirsting for righteousness, people who get persecuted for their stand for Christ, and yet they continue to love people anyway. Jesus had talked about our purpose to be the salt of the earth, preserving it from the decay of sin that is everywhere around us and even inside us, and to be the light of the world, pointing to Jesus Christ and pointing people to his kingdom and to a better way. And then we saw that there was a really high standard for those that expect to enter God's kingdom. Jesus had said in Matthew 5:20 that, I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. And then he went on to show them through the law how that was possible, how it was possible to outdo the Pharisees in terms of righteousness. And so he said, instead of simply not murdering, like it says in the law, don't hate people and make peace with them. Instead of simply not committing the physical act of adultery, don't commit the mental act of engaging in lust. Instead of being people who are known for only honoring our word in certain often official circumstances, be people of integrity who are known for their commitment to what is true and what is accurate, and who do what they say, and you can trust them just because they said it. Instead of carrying around bitterness towards our enemies, to proactively find ways to love and bless them, to make peace for them, and to return their evil for good. And so we've seen how Jesus skewered the Pharisees' teachings of the law. And now we're going to see today how he does the same thing, but this time with practices related to their faith, with the good things that they did. Because another way to be more righteous than the Pharisees is in our motives for the good and even the Christian things that we do. And so Jesus starts chapter 6, verse 1 with this statement: be careful not to do your acts of righteousness before men to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. This is an interesting verse because at first glance, it kind of sort of seems to conflict with something Jesus has just said in the chapter before. Remember in Matthew 5:16, Jesus said, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. And now he's saying, don't do your acts of righteousness in front of people to be seen by them. Well, what's he talking about? Why the apparent contradiction? What's the point here? The difference is in motive. The difference is what we're hoping to accomplish through it, what we're hoping to get out of it. Jesus said to be lights so that people may see and glorify our Father in heaven, as opposed to be seen as good or righteous ourselves. To remember that our true audience is God. You see, if we live out the traits described in the Beatitudes, if we truly are people who are humble, who are kind, who show mercy, we will be noticed for those things. But we should never live that way in order to be noticed and gain people's approval and admiration for those things. We live this way, when we live this way, to glorify God in heaven, because his love flows through us to love people. And if that is our focus, our heart and our motives will remain pure. The Pharisees, however, that was not their heart. That was not their motives. The good things that they did it for the status that it brought them. And so Jesus would say later in Matthew chapter 23, verses 5 through 7, describing them, he says, "But they do all their deeds to be noticed by men. For they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels of their garments." Those were their religious things that they wore on their clothes and in their hair. "They love the place of honor at banquets and the chief seats in the synagogues and respectful greetings in the marketplace and being called rabbi by men." They love the attention. They love the respect for being seen as righteous, for being seen as holy, for the good things that they did, for the titles and places of honor that it brought them. And so Jesus would say, you don't be that way. Don't let people call you rabbi or Lord or any of those. Don't have those kinds of titles. You're just brothers and sisters in Christ, and that's all. Humble people don't do those things to be recognized. The person who follows Jesus Christ has no desire to bring attention to themselves. And so Jesus is going to lay out 3 specific examples of how they did this. Examples that resonated in their culture and showed how the Pharisees' ways of doing things revealed a corrupt heart that was simply about status rather than pleasing God or pointing others to him. And so we can take those examples and then apply those principles to other things and see where we may be at risk of doing the same kinds of things. So he's going to talk about giving, he's going to talk about prayer, and he's going to talk about fasting. And you're going to see a pattern with all 3 of these where he says when you do these things, not if. All these things are things that we are expected to do as Christians. Jesus is not saying with any of these things, don't do them. They're all assumed to be a normal part of living for God. It's the why that matters. And he'll say, don't do it this way, the way they're doing it. And he'll point to the reward for doing it their way. And then he'll say, here's the right way to do it, and here's the reward for that. So let's look at these 3 things. He starts with giving in chapter 2. He says, so, there's that word, when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honored by men. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Giving is important. Within the church, to others in need, even outside the church, generous giving is a very important part of our walk with Christ and his work in the world. And when we see others doing it very generously, we sometimes recognize or honor that. And there's nothing at all wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with giving recognition and honor for things that we value. And there's also nothing wrong with receiving those recognitions or those honors. However, there is something very wrong when receiving the honor or the recognition or the reputation as a generous giver, when that becomes the point. When that becomes the pursuit, the reason why we're doing those things, then it becomes a real problem. Fundraisers face this conundrum, this difficulty, because there's strategies at work in raising more money. And some of those strategies entail appealing to people and offering them things, oftentimes public recognition, in return for what they give. And so you may have gone to a fundraiser banquet at some point in your life and you see different levels listed, maybe in a program or on a wall. And even sometimes in churches you see this in. And again, there's nothing necessarily wrong with highlighting and honoring people for giving more. That's not a problem. The problem becomes when we feel like these perks or this special access or this special attention is needed to raise the money. And when the people giving the money, when they do it for those things, when they do it for those expectations. For instance, someone may want to donate a lot of money for a building on a college campus. And they'll say, so how much do I need to give to put my name on that building? Now, there's lots of buildings around campuses that are not named for those reasons, but there are some that are absolutely named for those reasons. And the whole motivation behind it is, I want my name on that building. I want people to know. It's the public attention that becomes the focus. Jesus says what? He says, if that's your reason for giving, if that's your reason for being generous and giving a lot of money, then you have your reward in full right then. What does he mean? It means when you get your name put on that building, or when that person comes up to you and is very thankful for what you gave, and they shake your hand and they say thank you, or your name appears on that program, or however you're honored for in whatever way, that's your reward in full right then and there. Don't expect a reward from your Father in heaven, because you weren't doing it for him. You were doing it for the attention. You got it. That's your reward. Congratulations. This can happen in churches. There's a story early on in the book of Acts about two people named Ananias and Sapphira. You probably know this story. The church was growing and exploding, and there are passages about how the people were giving generously, and this one guy named Barnabas, who was very wealthy, saw certain needs in the church, and so he goes out and he sells some land, and he distributes it, and Barnabas becomes known as an apostle. He becomes a missionary partner of Paul. He's actually the one that kind of puts his word out there, his reputation out there to bring Paul in when Paul is a new believer. And so Barnabas, part of his story is that he was generous, and they saw his generosity. And Ananias and Sapphira saw that, and they said, you know what? That looks pretty good. We've got some land. And so they went and they sold it. And they brought the money to the apostles, just like Barnabas had done. And they laid it at his feet, but they lied about it. They said, we're giving you the full amount that we received for this land. But they had actually received more than that. Now, the bigger problem than just the fact that they lied, although that was a problem, the bigger problem was the heart. The bigger problem was that this wasn't done to help people. This wasn't done to further the mission of the church. This was done so that they could be viewed like people like Barnabas. People who could be put into leadership positions because they had the right heart, but their heart was wrong, and God stopped it. He did not let that happen. The opposite can also be the case. Instead of giving in order to gain reputation in the church, the opposite can also happen. I've heard of cases, I've never had this happen to me personally, but I've heard of pastor friends who've had people say to them, I'm going to stop giving if you don't do this. And leveraging the fact that they give a lot of money, and the pastor may know that, and they'll say, we're going to do this, and if we don't do this, I'm going to stop giving. I said, I've never had that personally happen to me. However, as a youth pastor years ago, I was told by my pastor that I needed to do certain things to make sure certain influential people in the church who gave a lot didn't get upset. I was told that. So this happens. When you give, and I hope that you do, because that is a key part of walking with Christ, but when you do, and when you give generously, you do so without expecting anything in return. You do so without expecting necessarily for anyone to even know that you did that, except for the people who absolutely need to know to record the money. That's what you do. Just a few months ago in February, there was a major earthquake in Turkey. It was a 7.8 magnitude on the Richter scale. And just a few hours later, it had a 7.5 magnitude aftershock, and many other aftershocks of lesser magnitude after that over the next several days. And it was devastating. They're continuing to rebuild today. They will be rebuilding for years. 46,000 people in Turkey died. More than 7,000 people also died in Syria. More than 250,000 buildings damaged or destroyed. Unimaginable destruction. And about a week after the earthquake, an anonymous person in the United States who's from Pakistan, so not even from one of these nations that was affected, walked into his embassy and anonymously donated $30 million. He did it anonymously. No one knows who it was except for the person recording the money. That's amazing. That's how we should be. In May of last year, there was a college graduation in Texas, in Marshall, at a little college called Wiley. Only had about 100 graduates. And in the middle of the graduation ceremony itself, the president made an announcement. He said that an anonymous donor had paid off the student loans for every student graduating there for a total, collectively, of over $300,000. He said, "You are debt-free. You do not owe the college a penny. If you have a balance, you had a balance." And it was done so anonymously. That's how you give without your right hand knowing what your left hand is doing. So give generously and do it without expecting anything, any recognition in return. And be careful. Be careful of the Ananias and Sapphires of the world. Be careful of giving too much admiration to those who give a lot of money and draw attention to it. The multi-billionaire who gives millions of dollars isn't necessarily being generous when it's 1% of their income, especially when they're doing it to bring attention to themselves. Beware of those who boast publicly about what they give or what they sacrifice, saying, "Look at my generosity." Beware of those people. They're getting tax benefits. They're getting access or influence because of that money. In some cases, if it's a politician, they're probably getting votes for that money, for the perception of being generous. They might be getting goodwill for future endeavors. They might be gaining influence so that people look the other way on other matters that they're doing, where they're doing things they shouldn't be doing. So don't be impressed by large amounts of money given by people who have large amounts of money to give and where it's still a small percentage of what they give when they're doing it to draw attention to themselves. Be careful. Well, then Jesus goes on from giving to talk about prayer. And in this passage is what we call the Lord's Prayer. We're not going to cover that today. We're actually going to come back to that next week, because that's an example that we're going to break down further, and that's more time than what we have for today. But Jesus gives the principles of prayers and just uses that prayer as an example. And so he says in verse 6, "When you pray," here's the same pattern, "when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by men. I tell you the truth, they receive their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. And when you pray, do not keep on babbling like pagans, for they think they will be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him." And then he tells them how to pray. You ever known someone that can get up and just give an incredible, eloquent prayer and say, "Boy, that person, they just know how to pray." They just do. Nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with being able to pray well in public. There's nothing wrong with admiring people who can pray well in public. There's a lot wrong with a person who looks for opportunities to pray well in public so that people can see them praying well in public. Same thing is true of preaching or teaching or leading music or anything that we do that's in the public eye. If it's done for the purpose of drawing attention to ourselves. If we do those things and people like it And they come up to us, whether it's praying, music, preaching, teaching, whatever it is, and they come to us and they say, good job, really enjoyed that, well done, and they say all that. If that's the reason you did it, then that's your reward right then and there, and that's it. Don't expect a reward from your Father in heaven because you didn't do it for him. You weren't doing it to draw people to Christ, you were doing it to draw their attention on you. So be careful. Be careful about those things where you are publicly ministering or speaking in some way. And then he goes on to fasting, the last one. He says, when you fast, again, when, not if, when, do not look at somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show men that they are fasting. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full. But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to men that you are fasting, but only to your Father who is unseen. And your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Now, fasting isn't something that in most Baptist circles we talk a lot about, and that's probably not a good thing. That's probably to our detriment. I think because fasting seems to be much more prevalent in some more charismatic and Pentecostal circles, I think sometimes we have shied more away from that than we should have because we don't want to do certain things in certain ways. However, fasting is a normal and expected part of living for God in both the Old and the New Testament. There are multiple fasts that were prescribed as part of the Jewish calendar. There was the Day of Atonement. There were other feasts. You see several examples in the Old Testament of people fasting in different circumstances. You see David when he was praying that the baby born through Bathsheba would be spared. You see Ezra when they're going back to Israel. You see the Jews in the Persian Empire during the time of Esther when they were at risk of being destroyed. You see Daniel when he's told he's not to pray, that no one is to pray to any other god but the golden one set up, or rather to the Persian emperor himself. And Daniel does anyway. He doesn't put on a show of it. Remember, we just read that about prayer. He doesn't put on a show of it. He doesn't make a big display of it. What does he do? He goes and he does it in private, in secret, just like he always did. But they were looking for it, and they caught him because that's what they were trying to do. But he wasn't making a show of it. He wasn't doing it in public. Jesus, he fasts in the wilderness for 40 days when he's being tempted. The church at Antioch, when Barnabas comes, they fast. So fasting is normal as part of living for Christ. But it was always as a means of reminding people of their dependence on God and to make them more aware of the needs of others. But instead, with the Pharisees, it had become a religious show to see who could look the most miserable, the most hungry, the most sad, the most mournful. And that was equated with holiness. And so the prophet Isaiah actually addressed the Israelites with their improper way of fasting 700 years before Jesus even came on the scene. In Isaiah 58, he tells them about the way they fasted back then. He quotes what they're saying to God because they think they're fasting and yet they're not getting anything out of it. God is still judging them. Things are still going poorly. And so there are quotes from them, and then God through Isaiah responds. Why have we fasted, they say, and you, God, have not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves, and you have not noticed? And God responds, is this the kind of fast I have chosen? Only a day for a man to humble himself? Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed, for lying on sackcloth and ashes? Is that what you call a day of fast? A day acceptable to the Lord? Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen, to loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe him and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood? Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help, and he will say, here I am. When your fasting is for the right reason, when it's reminding you of your dependence on God, when it's causing you to care for the needs of others, then your fasting will make a difference because your heart will be different and God will respond. Fasting was not to gain God's attention. It wasn't to make your prayers count more. It wasn't a negotiating tactic to get a blessing from God. It was to rely fully on him. The Pharisees, on the other hand, did it regularly, and they did it publicly to make sure everyone knew about it, to make a big production out of it, through wailing, through sackcloth, through ashes, through these big shows, and people were fooled into believing they were more holy or spiritually connected to God as a result. And Jesus said, they have the reward in full. But it's not from the Father, because they're not doing it for him. Prayer is not about what you get. Fasting is not about what you get. It is focused on God and to focus you more on him. And so these three things, giving and prayer and fasting, they're just examples. There are other ways that we can do good things for the wrong reasons. I already mentioned a couple while ago, teaching, preaching, leading music. There are other things we can do that are good, that we can do just to get attention for ourselves, things that we're particularly good at. Maybe it's making food. Maybe it's fixing things. Maybe it's anything that's done in and around the church that people see. It could be playing an instrument. It could be running soundboard. It could be literally anything if it's not done with the right heart. If it's done so that people will see us and thank us and praise us for it and think that we're more spiritual or holy or good people or whatever, if that's the reason, whenever that's the reason, that's an example of what Jesus is saying, don't be like this. And we've got to be careful, because anything that we do that is good, anything that we can do to honor God, can shift in focus from something with the right intention to something with impure motives. Many people have fallen into arrogance and pride and the roar of the crowd who started off right. Because when you do things that people think well of, whether it's any of the things we've mentioned, and people think well of you, and they give you the compliments, it can be real hard to not let that go to your head, especially if you're insecure. We have to constantly check our hearts to make sure that when we receive those compliments, when we receive those things, when we receive those honors, whatever that looks like, to resist the temptation to pat ourselves on the back. And then to do it next time so that we get patted on the back again. So how do you respond after you do something and people come up and compliment you? Where are you tempted to do something but for the praise of people? Are you upset for not being recognized for something that you did do? Do you feel like you are not getting the credit that you deserve? In other words, why do you do the good things that you do? Is it with pure motives, or is it to gain reputation? And what would you do differently if the only thing on your mind was pleasing God and loving others? There was an African-American tennis player. He died in the 1990s, but he has a quote that relates to this that I just love. He said, "True heroism is remarkably sober, very undramatic. It is not the urge to surpass all others at whatever cost, but the urge to serve others at whatever cost." That's how we serve. That's how we're to live. So how can you ensure that love for God and love for others is the motive for your ministry? Let's pray. Heavenly Father, Lord, I pray that you would help us to be honest with you in this moment of reflection and prayer. That you would expose any areas of our heart where we have lapsed into pride and arrogance and seeking the praise and reputation of others. Lord, may we care only about your view of us and being approved by you. Lord, may your reward be enough. May your love for us be enough. And when we do things for people, may it not be so that they respond to us in a certain way. May it be so that they respond to you in a certain way so that they see you through us and turn to you as a result. And so, God, cleanse our hearts, remove the selfishness, and may we be fully committed to you and only you. And so we lift these things up in Jesus' name. Amen.